what you have is perfect. Lord, may the desires of our heart be truly you and not something of this world that will fail, something of this world that will lead us astray, something of this world that will give us something that is insufficient. Lord, you made us for you. God, to know you this morning is our desire. And God, as we dig into your word, I pray. On the road to Damascus, on his way to kill and persecute Christians, Jesus Christ just showed up, boom, in a bright light, blinded Paul, and said, Paul, why are you persecuting me? He says, who are you? Well, I'm Jesus. He says, who are you, Lord, actually? I'm Jesus, he said, whom you are persecuting. And then he gave him orders. Paul's life changed immediately from that point. He had an encounter. Jesus Christ saved him. But he says, of course I'm not rejected because I'm an Israelite myself, a descendant of Abraham from the tribe of Benjamin. God did not reject his people of whom he foreknew. So God didn't mess up here. He says, don't you know what the scripture says in the passage about Elijah and how he appealed to God against Israel? This comes out of 1 Kings chapter 19 is what he's referencing. Elijah gets before 450 prophets of Baal and 300 prophets of Asherah. That's 800 to 1. And everybody's worshiping Baal or Baal, if you want to say it properly, but we're in the south, so it's Baal, okay? They're worshiping him, and all by himself, Elijah steps up and he says, okay, let's do a little contest. You get Baal and all your people and worship him, and let's set up an altar, and you call your God, little g, to call down fire from heaven and consume the altar. If he does that, we'll worship your God, and I'll call on my God all by myself, and I'll worship. What do you think happened? Well, Elijah ends up getting before the prophets, and the prophets start going in this ritual, and they get so crazy that they even start cutting themselves and doing all these crazy ritual acts, and nothing happens. So, Elijah uses strong language, and he basically calls them out and says, your God's on the potty. You can tell I have a 3-year-old because I use the word potty. Your God must be on the potty. That's why nothing's happened. And then he says, here's what I want you to do. Multiple times over, pour water on this altar. Keep pouring it. Do it again, do it again, do it again. And he calls to God. And God consumes the altar, not only the wood, but he consumes the rocks that the altar's built of. And God says, there you go. Now, you would think that Elijah would walk away from that being like, all right, I'm confident. But Elijah actually walks away, and Ahab was the king at the time, and Jezebel. You ever met a Jezebel? You probably haven't. No parents name their daughter Jezebel because of the one in the Bible. You don't want your daughter walking around school and, hey, Jezebel, come here. Because when you call somebody a Jezebel, that's not a good term. Jezebel, the wife of the king, threatens Elijah's life right after this, and Elijah gets fearful, and he comes to God, and he says this, verse 3, Lord, they have killed your prophets and torn down your altars. I'm the only one left, and they're trying to kill me. Maybe in your family or at school or at your workplace, you feel like you're the only Christian. You're the only one that you really know. You don't really know a lot of Christians, like real Christians, like people that live for the gospel and they speak about the gospel. Feeling alone is tough. Well, verse 4, and what was God's answer to him? Paul says, okay, how did God answer Elijah? He says, I've reserved for myself 7,000 who have not bowed the knee to Baal. You know what God's saying to you? You just haven't looked yet. You might feel alone. You might feel like you have been rejected by everybody and you're the only one like you. You're the only follower of Christ. But I've got some people. I've got some legit people. You just haven't met them. We go through times in history where it seems like Christianity, and it seems like we're in that cycle right now, becomes less and less prominent. And what I mean by prominent is true followers of Christ. It's hard to find somebody that really truly looks like a biblical Christian in love with Jesus Christ. Verse 5, and this is where we get this idea of remnant. So too, at the present time, there is a remnant chosen by grace. He says, I've got 7,000 people. It's a remnant in comparison to the world. But let me tell you what, it's a godly remnant. It's a strong remnant. It's a remnant that will change the course of history. Answer out loud, how many disciples did Jesus have? 12. Apostles, disciples. Some of you were like, would you mean disciples or apostles? You knew what I meant. 12. Well, even in that 12, there was a remnant in that 12, and his name was Judas. So there's always a remnant in a group of people that is not like the rest, that stands out. Judas was a remnant of the devoted followers of Jesus Christ. He was a remnant that was not like them. So Jesus had a remnant of 12, and then even in that 12, there was something corrupt. There was something not legit. Well, what did God do with that 12? He changed the world. You're sitting here for some reason. I don't know why you came today. I don't know why you're watching online, but you're doing that for some reason as a result of these men who laid down their life to get the gospel out, Paul being one. We're reading something that Paul wrote and he died for. He says, and if by grace, verse 6, then it is no longer by works. If it were grace, no longer would be grace. Basically what he's saying is, just go back a few chapters, you cannot get to Jesus by works. It's by grace. That's why the Bible uses words like the narrow way to Christ and the wide road that leads to destruction. And many are on that one, and few find this one. There's a few. There's a remnant. There's a small group of people, but it's clear who they are. He says, what then? What Israel sought so earnestly it did not obtain, but the elect did. The others were hardened, as it is written. And this comes from Isaiah and Deuteronomy. God gave them a spirit of stupor, eyes so that they could not see, and ears that they could not hear, to this very day. You ever tried to share Christ with somebody, and it's almost like they cover their eyes and cover their ears? They get to this place where they can't see or hear what you're saying. David even says it in verse 9. And David says, may their table become a snare and a trap, a stumbling block, and the retribution for them. May their eyes be darkened so that they cannot see, and their backs bent forever. So Paul gets us to this place when we talk about just a remnant and rejection. So I want you to write this down. You got, ultimately, in the end of the day, here's some options. And ultimately, my options are, number one, be God's remnant or the world's rebel. Remnant theology, let me handle this. There's churches out there today that have a remnant theology.